Alright, so I finished draining. So I carried this thing over. We're going to get it to a boil. So just out of curiosity, I'm going to take a gravity reading here just to see where we're at. That's probably too much even. You only need a couple drops. Try to see if I can do this with one hand. I don't know if that'll work. So it's about 9.6 bricks right now, which I'm going to convert that. I use this bricks calc app on my phone. 9.8, that comes out to 1.039 for the original gravity. Our target is 1.042. So we're under, but keep in mind we're going to boil off a lot of this water during the boil. And of course, if you boil off the water, you're not boiling off the sugar. So the sugar will get more concentrated and raise the gravity. So I think we're in pretty good shape. But let's get this burner fired up and get this thing going. We're going to boil for 60 minutes. So I'll get it started. Once we're at a boil, I'll come back on and explain what we're doing next. So it's getting close to boiling now. Once it gets close, you can kind of tell. It gets that foam on the top. And you want to really be careful here, because once it starts boiling, especially if you're close to the top of your pot, which I got maybe 4 inches or so to spare, but it'll boil over very, very quickly. So you want to make sure you cut down your heat way down as soon as it starts to boil. We can see, I think I saw it start to go. Yep, she's starting to boil. I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting it down a little bit. Because it'll boil over very quickly once it starts going. So once it gets close, I like to cut it way down, and then you can increase it a little bit as you go. You want a nice good boil going, because we got to boil off a good amount of this liquid still. There we go. So I want it to boil a little bit harder than what it's doing right now. But I'm going to let it kind of settle out for a couple minutes here. I'm going to turn it up a little bit. Get a nice good boil going. And then basically from there, we're doing a 60-minute boil. This is a very, very basic recipe. The only thing we're adding is an ounce of hops. Well, it says 60 minutes, so let's add it right now. Grab our hops, which in this case are glacier hops, which I've never actually had before. You can see this is getting pretty high. It's really rising, even though I turned it way down. So I'm going to turn it down maybe even a little bit more, just so it's barely going there. If you boil it over, it's a huge mess. You don't want that. Open these hops here, and they're hop pellets, which are great. They work very well. We'll stir that up a little bit. And a lot of recipes, if you're doing my last batch I did a double IPA, and that had tons of hop additions. So I was adding hops all the time. This, basically, that's it. That's our beer. So now we just have to let this thing boil for 60 minutes. So I'm going to set my timer and just keep an eye on it so it doesn't boil over. But yeah, you got an hour to wait. So now we got a nice boil going. Like, that's about where I want it to be. A nice rolling boil with some evaporation. I figure what I'm going to do, I have these cocoa nibs, which smell amazing. It's basically like chocolate. Cocoa beans or something. Let me show you what they look like. So I'm going to throw these in. Basically, I just had them laying around. Wasn't really... I had them for another recipe. But I figure they won't last forever, so might as well use them. So this is an oatmeal stout, and I just threw some chocolate in there, so that's gonna be nice. And like I said, what we're gonna do with this is I'm gonna experiment a little bit. After it's done fermenting, I'm gonna split it into 2 containers for secondary fermentation. I think I'm gonna do like a raspberry jalapeno for one. I grew the jalapeno peppers over in my garden over there this summer. The garden's pretty dead right now, but I got peppers in the freezer. And then I'll do vanilla cinnamon for the other batch. It's kind of fun to just mess around with stuff. I kind of get like the inspiration for it from food. At the farmer's market, I bought some jalapeno raspberry jam, which I thought actually tasted pretty good. So I figured I'll use that flavor profile for one. And then vanilla cinnamon, I go to take my son to a bagel shop locally here every Saturday. And vanilla cinnamon bagels are the best ones they have, so I figure that's another good flavor that we'll try. So we'll split the batch. This is just a pretty basic oatmeal stout, so we'll spice it up a little with some different flavors and see how it turns out. So that's the fun of home brewing. You can kind of do whatever you want. Okay, we have about 15-20 minutes left of this brew. As you can see, it's gone down quite a ways. A lot has evaporated. You can kind of see the line where it started. That's my son. So what we're going to do now is this is the wort chiller. So what this does is it cools it off very quickly for us once it is finished. We'll hook it up to our hose with this end right here, and then water flows through the copper and it cools it off. Right. And I actually made this. You can save about half the price by doing it yourself. You can just go buy copper tubing from like Home Depot or Lowe's and kind of just twist it around. It's not really hard to do at all. Just bend it a little bit, and then you buy these vinyl hoses with some clamps. And yeah, that's all there is to it. So what we want to do is dump this in the pot about 15 minutes before the end of the boil, and that's going to sanitize it for us. So we got 15 minutes left. Alright, it's getting dark, so good thing we're finishing up. So I hope you can still see, but it's been 60 minutes, boil's done, so I'm going to go ahead and shut the burner off. And we're going to get the chiller going. So all we have to do is now turn on the hose. Now the water will be flowing through, and it'll start cooling this off. Depending on the time of year, it'll vary how fast it chills. See, it's coming out quite a bit. But probably about 15 minutes or so. So all you have to do now is let it sit. And this is my fermenter. This is the Big Mouth Bubbler, the glass one, which I highly recommend. So much nicer than like a plastic bucket. Very, very nice. But what we need to do is sanitize it. And I use Star Sand for that. This is the big bottle, so I can measure it out here. We basically need 1 ounce per 5 gallons. So let me try to do that with one hand here. I set this down for just a second. All right. So I measured out basically 1 ounce in this cap here. Dump that in. And then I'll use some of the water that comes out of this thing to fill up the fermenter, and that's going to sanitize it. Now careful when you first turn this thing on if you have a wort chiller, because the water coming out here is pretty hot at first, and it can really burn you. So we'll fill it up. We'll let this thing cool. We're almost done. Once it's cool, we're going to dump out the sanitized water in here. We're going to dump the wort into the fermenter and add the yeast, and we'll be done. So I'll come back when this thing is cool and ready to go. We want it to get to about 78 degrees or so. I just took a reading with the refractometer, and it's exactly 1.042 for the original gravity, which is exactly what the recipe called for. So we hit it perfectly. And if you remember, I think we were at like 1.039 earlier before the boil. So like I said, it would drop some during the boil because of the evaporation. Alright, so it's down to 78 degrees. That's enough. That's cool enough for the yeast. So I'm going to go ahead and dump this fermenter out. You see I'm sanitizing the scissors and the yeast packet in here. And so I'm going to go ahead and dump this out now, and then I'm going to pour the beer, or the wort. Alright, so I got it poured into the fermenter. So what I'm going to do now is put the lid on, and you want to aerate it a little bit, because the yeast also needs oxygen. So I'm going to put this lid on. Take this cap off here. Put my hand on top and shake it up a little bit. That should be good. I'm going to take the lid back off. Now I'm going to cut open this yeast packet, which is fully sanitized. So are the scissors. We'll set the camera down for a minute here. So I'm going to cut this. So I'm going to cut this open, and then just sprinkle it on top. And that's a dry yeast. So the yeast is in. Now I just got to add the cap back, seal it up, put your airlock on, and that's all there is to it. Now you just got to let it ferment, and I'll make another video to update with that. Hope you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions.